Today is February 16, 2018, and we are going to continue our discussion of experience not reliable, which is a testimony written by Ellen White, published in Volume 3 of the Testimonies. So let's start with asking our Heavenly Family to help us to grasp all these principles. Heavenly Family, thank you once again for teaching us this message and for showing us the two ways, truth and error, and for educating us to understand how to tell the difference and how to fall in love with and act in harmony with truth. Please continue to teach us along those lines. Help us tonight to understand these principles better than ever before, and help us to advance to be a people of truth and love. Thank you. We ask this in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
So as I mentioned, the testimony that we have been discussing for quite a while is found in Volume 3 of the Testimonies for the Church, and it starts on page 67 and goes till page 79. We are currently on page 73, but have been having some great discussion along the way, which has caused us to go a bit slower than if we were just trying to get through the testimony. But we're not just trying to get through the testimony. Our purpose is to understand the principles and to benefit from it as much as possible. And I think that we've had some really great discussions regarding what we're reading here. I'll just mention a few things about the testimony and our discussion of it before we dive back in. So, what is this testimony all about? Well, in this testimony, Ellen White is drawing a sharp distinction between two kinds of experience. One kind of experience is the type that Ellen White says is what people generally term experience. And we've understood that to be simply passing through circumstances and having a perception concerning those circumstances and drawing conclusions based off of that. That type of experience is what Ellen White characterizes as being not reliable. And she gives us several indications of what that experience is like, which we'll come back to. The other kind of experience, which Ellen White refers to as genuine experience, is not merely going through a circumstance and drawing conclusions based off of it. It is actually knowledge which has been derived by a variety of careful experiments. Experiments, as spoken of in this testimony, are actual experiments, real, genuine, actual experiments with the removal of bias, with an understanding of the principle involved in the action, in harmony with natural law and science. These are all phrases which Ellen White uses in order to explain what she is referring to. So, to further unpack this, false experience is characterized as being rooted in superstition, contrary to natural law, and also as being in conflict with scientific principles. Genuine experience, as I've already mentioned, is in harmony with science and natural law and is built upon experimentation. Now, Ellen White isn't kind of pretending when she says this. No, the setting of this testimony is that she is writing to a woman who had health difficulties and believed that she knew, based off of her experiences, how to go about fixing her health problems. And Ellen White was writing to her and saying, look, your experience is not reliable, because that's the nature of experience under the usual usage of the term. What Ellen White was counseling this woman to do was to yield her own judgment, which was based on her experience, and instead to go with the judgment of those who were professionals in their practice as being physicians, because they had a far more complete knowledge of the human body and health and disease and how to treat disease than this woman possibly could, because they were educated along those lines. They were trained in order to understand those subjects. Ellen White, in this testimony, not only is giving advice to this one woman, she is laying out general principles which apply to us all. It is the case for all of us that our experience, under the usual usage of the term, is not reliable. That applies when it comes to health, when it comes to religion, when it comes to everything. When we want to come to conclusions about reality, our experience is not reliable to land us on the truth. We have to conduct experiments, and we have to do so not just as individuals, but together as not just a group of a few individuals, but humanity at large. Ideally, that is, anyone who's actually willing to engage in the experimental process, and this is what science does. The scientific community is a group of individuals who have been trained in very specific and high, I'll just say high requirement fields of knowledge. It's very specialized. It requires a lot of education in order to really understand scientific subjects. And scientists are trained in those subjects and trained in the methods of how to experiment. And it is simply not the case that scientists do their own experiments, publish their results, goes out to the world, and then that's it. No, that's not how it works, and there's a good reason why that is not how it works. Scientists first submit their experiments and the results to other scientists in their field, who then critique their experiments and try to repeat them, and it goes through this whole peer review process. That is a very important part of science, and it's a humbling thing, because everyone has to realize that they cannot do it on their own. No one can be the star, as it were, because everyone has to work together. And that's just a beautiful lesson to learn from science. And science actually does bring people together far more than religion does, because when it comes to religion, people don't have any sort of real standard to go by which they may come to agreement. It's based off of dogmatic positions, which by definition will not be yielded even in face of apparent evidence to the contrary. Science, on the other hand, is a process which is built on the standard of truth, and in science, truth is material reality, and people all have to come to agreement with that. That's just the way it works. And so the projects that humanity has done that have required the most cooperation between individuals have been accomplished in science. And people are able to put aside their differences and work together for the common good in science more than in any other field. And the reason why is because of scientific experiment. It's the method of experimentation and the standard of evidence that draws people to be able to work together. And perhaps the best example of that is the creation of the Large Hadron Collider, which took something of around like 10,000 scientists or something like that, who spoke like, I think it was a couple dozen languages and of all various perspectives and whatever, and they all come together to do this task that's extremely complex and requires a lot of collaboration and cooperation, and it's just incredible that this was able to actually work socially. Even just the dynamics of people to accomplish such a task is a feat for sure. And so I'm just trying to highlight some of the differences really between these two types of experiment and the benefits of the scientific method. And this is really what Ellen White was advocating, that we employ the scientific method. You know, that's one of the things I love about this testimony and certain statements in it, which are also found in Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, page 109, because there Ellen White fully endorses the scientific method. And not only does she endorse it for scientific subjects, but she applies it to everything. And specifically even to religion, which is the area where science is usually not applied. And often people think, oh, well, they can't be, they address two separate lists of questions, and they operate in separate domains, and science and religion don't really have overlap, so therefore they can't really contradict each other, nor can they apply to each other. Ellen White really gave a very different perspective on that. She applied the principles that are foundational to science to all things and advocated that that's how we ought to operate, because that is how we can have genuine experience. Anything short of that is not genuine experience. And this testimony is really incredible, how Ellen White describes false experience and true experience. And when she describes false experience, she says, thus it has been with the religious world generally. One of our reasons for going through this is to really see how, as religious people in general, and specifically even as Adventists, Davidians, and branches, we have had at least a certain degree of an anti-science perspective, and that is not justified or justifiable. In this testimony, Ellen White speaks of false experience and superstition and religion, and how the religious world is really going along this line, and how it's a bad thing, a really, really bad thing. And then she speaks, on the other hand, of science and she speaks of it as such a good thing, and she really promotes it. And that's what we want to do in this meeting as well. And really, ultimately, this message has been doing that from the beginning, especially in regards to materialism and how to acquire knowledge based on materialism. Ultimately, it's experiment. Ultimately, it is science, and we need to be able to change our perspective to really be in harmony with science, because that is how experiment works. That's what genuine experience really is. And I think it's really a great thing for us to be going through this testimony so that we can become people who believe what we know and know what we believe. So anyway, we have had great discussions on this. Some of it has focused on health because that's what the testimony is set in, I should say. So it's obviously a very relevant topic, and health really has lots of good examples of genuine experience and false experience. But obviously it does go far beyond that. So I just want to ask, does anyone have any comments or questions on this overall topic? All right. Well, in that case, we will continue on reading the testimony and discussing it and see what we learn. So we have read all of the content of the paragraphs on page 72. And just to refresh our memory as to what Ellen White said in these paragraphs, she was talking about how these principles of genuine experience and false experience apply even to religion. And then she went to the story of Adam and Eve and the fall. But she tells this story to draw very different lessons from what we normally hear when this story is recounted. And what she focuses on is the fact that Eve had an experience which misled her. Her experience was not reliable. The fruit was good to eat, tasted good. She imagined that it changed her and all of these wonderful things. But really, it wasn't good. She related that experience to Adam, and he went on her testimonial. And Ellen White is trying to highlight, look guys, see, experience is not reliable. To me, it's incredible how she's highlighting this to be a true principle even in a perfect world. Even in a perfect world, we need to go by experiment rather than just trusting our own senses and the circumstances through which we pass and our own interpretation of them.
That's a really good point. I'm so glad you brought it out, because it's really easy to fall into the mindset that, oh, in a perfect world, quote unquote, you don't have to worry about anything, and you just can kind of like
go with the flow.
Go with the flow and let your guard down is the way I was looking at it. Kind of just let your guard down, not really be careful about things, because everyone's going to automatically do everything perfectly. But the problem with that type of reasoning is we completely ignore the fact that there was a fall from a perfect world to begin with.
Exactly.
And it totally flies in the face of reason to think that just because we went through this whole sin thing, that all of a sudden we're just not going to have to care about the same principles that govern truth in the first place. But unless we do care about these principles, even in a perfect world, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes.
Yeah. And that ultimately, Ellen White is tracing this down to Adam and Eve, but ultimately this goes even back to Lucifer.
That's what I had in mind.
Yeah, because he went on his own perception of things without testing to see if it was in harmony with reality. See, here's the thing. It's just the nature of reality that we perceive things to a limited degree and not always entirely accurately. That's not necessarily the result of sin or anything like that. It's just the fact that simply not perceiving it all leaves room for drawing false conclusions, but you have to test those conclusions. That's kind of the point. And so there's always potential for someone to go with a misperception.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we have to really get down to this experimental thing. And the thing that I love about this, too, is that Ellen White is connecting this directly with morality as well. She does that on page 72, both with the Adam and Eve story, and then also in her direct comments, she actually connects it with morality. She says that a true experience will be in perfect harmony with natural and divine law. Well, what does she mean by divine law? Well, she explains in the next sentence. False experience will array itself against science and the principles of Jehovah. Oh, sorry, the sentence after that, too. The religious world is covered with a pall of moral darkness. This is also explained earlier as well. It's connected with morality. We might think that, this just has to do with our scientific conclusions and what we think about health and what we think about cosmology and what we think about whatever else. No, this has to do with everything. We need to be experimentalists with everything, because if we are not, we will end up going with some misperception of reality in our own day-to-day life and act upon it and end up violating moral laws, sinning. That's how all this started. So it's really, really an important subject. So anyway, we will continue on now with page 73, paragraph 1. Balaam inquired of God if he might curse Israel, because in so doing he had the promise of great reward. And God said, Thou shalt not go. But he was urged by the messengers, and greater inducements were presented. Balaam had been shown the will of the Lord in this matter, but he was so eager for the reward that he ventured to ask God the second time. The Lord permitted Balaam to go. Then he had a wonderful experience, but who would wish to be guided by such an experience? There are those who would understand their duty clearly if it were in harmony with their natural inclinations. Circumstances and reason may clearly indicate their duty, but when against their natural inclination, these evidences are frequently set aside.
Mm-hmm.
Then these persons will presume to go to God to learn their duty.
Mm-hmm.
But God will not be trifled with. He will permit such persons to follow the desires of their own hearts. Psalm 81, verses 11 and 12. But my people would not hearken to my voice. So I gave them up unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels. So that's the end of the paragraph. Here, Ellen White is building upon what she said in previous paragraphs. The paragraph just before this, she talks about people daring to go to God to pray about something that they already know. The answer is already there. It's already evident. And the point is, God is not into just telling someone something that they want to hear. God is about truth. And if you already know the truth, why go to God to ask if that's the truth or what the truth is on that issue? It just doesn't work like that. That's not reasonable. It's kind of a view that God is somehow above the truth or greater than the truth. If truth is ultimately it, like if that's the prime thing, and if it is a reality even more fundamental than God, which we've talked about, how materialism, material reality is just the nature of reality, and that is the way it is. God isn't the nature of reality. No, matter is the nature of reality. And so if material reality is one way, even if God was to say it was another way, it wouldn't make it right.
And it wouldn't make it so.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the point, that truth is ultimately where it's at anyway. So if you know the truth, why go to God and try to convince him to convince you otherwise? Or why go to God to have him tell you what you already know? The point is, truth, materialism is fundamental. And I just love how Ellen White is going into this. Obviously, she's not explaining it using the same terms that I am, but her comments in this regard imply that. Why would it be wrong to go ask God about the truth of something if you already know the truth? If God was fundamental, it could make the truth be anything, then maybe that would be okay. But since reality transcends God, then we can't go to God to try and change it or tell us something other than the truth, or even to just have him repeat something to us for the sake of it because we want some sort of experience. Continuing on. Those who desire to follow a course which pleases their fancy are in danger of being left to follow their own inclinations, supposing them to be the leadings of God's Spirit. The duty of some is indicated sufficiently clear by circumstances and facts, but through the solicitations of friends, in harmony with their own inclinations, they swerve from the path of duty and pass over the clear evidences in the case. Then, with apparent conscientiousness, they pray long and earnestly for light. They have earnest feeling in the matter, and they interpret this to be the Spirit of God. But they are deceived. This course grieves the Spirit of God. They had light, and in the very reason of things should have understood their duty. But a few pleasing inducements balance their minds in the wrong direction, and they urge these before the Lord and press their case, and the Lord allows them to have their own way. They have so strong an inclination to follow their own course that he permits them to do so and to suffer the results. These imagine that they have a wonderful experience. This should be startling to us. It's really incredible how it's like, man, truth is prime. We have to go with truth. Let's not go to God to try and make things go a certain way for us. And the other thing that Ellen White is so well pointing out is the bias that is so often there when people go to God. People don't treat our Heavenly Family like educators. People treat them like genies. They want some magic done for them. But that is not what our Heavenly Family is about. Our Heavenly Family is about being educators. They are not magicians, nor could they be, because magic does not exist. And it's just so important to go to them as educators to seek to learn the truth, rather than to go to them with our own inclinations and desires and preferences. I mean, these are really just biases. We want things to be a certain way, and we want to use our Heavenly Family to get things to be that way. How selfish is that? That's not what it's about. Let's go to them as educators. Let's go to them as teachers. Then we'll have a far better understanding of reality, and we will learn not to allow our own biases to influence how we go about making decisions. And it's incredible how people approach this in the entirely wrong way. And this happens every day, where tons of people are going to God not to learn, but to get what they want. Mm-hmm. And it's just incredible how people, God is like, okay, if you really want it your way that bad, go ahead and have it your way. And then people interpret it as the Holy Spirit speaking to them and telling them, oh, well, God told me that I'm supposed to go down this path or whatever. It's like, man, such a misunderstanding, such a huge misunderstanding. I hope you guys are all really following this. And hopefully we will all take the correction. Because I don't expect that it's the case that no one here goes to our Heavenly Family with their inclinations and biases and tries to get what they want. Well, let's learn to do things differently. Continuing with the testimony. My dear sister, firmness is a strong and controlling influence in your mind. You have acquired strength to stand up and brace against opposition and carry through difficult and perplexing enterprises. You do not love contention. You are highly sensitive and feel deeply. You are strictly conscientious, and your judgment must be convinced before you will yield to the opinions of others. Had your physical health been unimpaired, you would have made an eminently useful woman. You have long been diseased, and this has affected your imagination so that your thoughts have been concentrated upon yourself, and the imagination has affected the body. Your habits have not been good in many respects. Your food has not been of the right quantity or quality. You have eaten too largely and of a poor quality of food, which could not be converted into good blood. You have educated the stomach to this kind of diet. This, your judgment has taught you, was the best, because you realized the least disturbance from it. But this was not a correct experience. I just want to pause there to say, how often do people think like this? Whatever causes the least disturbance is the right thing. That's what people think. So if you're doing something with health and, oh, that's causing disturbance, oh, that must not be ultimately the right thing. Oh, I'm doing this other thing and it's not causing disturbance, so it must be the right way to go.
That's not a good enough basis upon which to come to a conclusion, especially if you don't even know what the problem is to begin with.
Absolutely, and it could be deadly. I mean, someone could have a disease that's deadly with zero side effects, and there's a treatment for it that can actually kill the disease, but that treatment may cause side effects. And then let's say that there's another so-called treatment for it, a homeopathic treatment. Well, if they were to follow the path of least disturbance, they would go with the homeopathic treatment. Taking a few sugar pills probably isn't going to cause that much trouble, but it's not going to help you either. And someone could destroy their body by doing that if they're allowing a deadly disease to take over, even if they are not experiencing side effects from it. The right thing to do in that circumstance would be to take the effective treatment, even if they experience some side effects that are negative. So that would have more disturbance, but they could actually kill their disease. And this is just a hypothetical type of circumstance that I'm using as an example. Another thing that I'll point out here is that people often take a lack of disturbance as a sign that it's God's will in circumstances in life. And if there's difficulty, they take it as a sign that it's not God's will. Where did that come from? Where did people get that idea? You know, people often think, oh, you know, God just closed this door and closed that door, and this door was open. Like, it would just, everything flowed so smoothly, we just knew it was the will of God.
Prosperity preaching.
I guess it's a form of that, yeah. Mm-hmm. But it's this type of idea, though, is present everywhere. I mean, I've heard Adventists say this my whole life, where it's like people think that something going smoothly is some sort of evidence that it's the right thing, and things not going smoothly means that, oh, it must not be the right thing.
That must come from the idea that God controls everything that happens.
That could very well be it.
And of course, God only wants good things for you, which I'm not negating that. But if you have the idea that God controls literally everything that happens, then you can go a couple different ways with that. But one way that you can go is, oh, well, then God must not be behind this because it's not going easy.
But again, even that doesn't make sense, because if you're going down a path and you think God controls everything and it's not easy, you could think, well, God must not want it to be easy. You could also draw that conclusion just as justifiably. So you'd have to say, God controls everything, and God just wants it to be easy for me. And, well, what if that's not the best? What if ease isn't actually just the best thing for us all the time? So that whole thing is the whole idea of thinking that something going smoothly is an indication of God's will and something being difficult is an indication that it's not God's will is really a manifestation of a false idea of experience. And what is a genuine experience? Because that is a false experience. When someone goes through something and it's smooth and concludes that it's God's will because of that, no, that's a false experience. Just like when someone goes through something that's difficult and concludes that therefore it must not be God's will. Man, I mean, did Jesus have it easy? You know? I mean, that's the type of example that people usually go to. So it's inconsistent or people are usually inconsistent in how they approach this, because people will also recognize Jesus and all the prophets as being people who went through difficult experiences, and yet it was God's will, you know. So that's definitely a habit of thought to break ourselves of, and I hope that you all consider that seriously. In each circumstance, we need to determine what the right thing is by means of experiment. You know, Ellen White points this out often, how circumstances and facts are enough to show us our duty. Now, notice she's not saying that a circumstance is what gives us our genuine experience. No, she's just saying that the circumstances and the facts are enough to show us our duty. In other words, if you look at the circumstance and you study it, you can usually derive from that what the appropriate response is. So if you don't really know what the circumstance is, you won't know what to do in it. But if you become acquainted with the reality of the circumstance, and the way to do that, to become acquainted with that, is through experiment, not through just going with whatever, then you can learn from it what you need to do.
I had a scripture that I've always loved, kind of on this topic. I was just going to share it if you don't mind. It was Hebrews 11, starting in verse 32. It's, you know, the Hall of Fame of Faith, and it says, "What more shall I say? For a time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Japheth, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Through faith they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, gained strength and weakness, became mighty to battle, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead to raise to life, but others were tortured, not accepting release to obtain resurrection to a better life. Others experienced mocking and flogging and chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawn in two, murdered with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and caves and openings in the earth. And these all were commended for their faith, yet they did not receive what was promised. For God has provided something better for us, so that they would be made perfect together with us."
Excellent, and so very fitting. Yeah, thank you for reading that. Yeah, well, I really hope that everyone contemplates that principle for sure.
There's a comment I have also on this paragraph at the beginning portion. Well, two comments. The first one I'll make on the end of the paragraph, where she starts to get, maybe I'm jumping ahead. Anyway, she starts to talk a little bit about some of the specifics, about your habits have not been good in many respects, your food has not been of the right quantity or quality, you've eaten too largely and of a poor quality of food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I know it could be easy for us to kind of revert into, oh, what does Ellen White say to this woman about what she's doing or not doing for her health? That's where I'm going to get my health counsel. And I just want to remind us all that Ellen White herself says that we are to get our information on health from the best authors on the subject. So the health authorities, Dr. Hott expands on this. So keep that in mind when you read any specific health advice from Ellen White, that she got her knowledge on, the way Dr. Hott puts it is, she got her knowledge on food values and that sort of thing, not from heaven, but from the best health authorities of her day. Now, that's not to say that she didn't get divine revelation about the importance of health and certain things regarding that.
Like the principles about how we are to deal with our health, which is what we're reading here.
Yeah, and why health is so important and that sort of thing. So, it's not to say, oh, God didn't talk to Ellen White at all about health. It's just that he didn't show her specifically what the truth is about
what to eat, what not to eat, how to treat disease, etc.
How to treat disease specifically was kind of where I was trying to go with that, like what a doctor would do. But anyway, so there's that I wanted to comment on. But also at the very beginning, she says, my dear sister, firmness is a strong and controlling influence in your mind. You have acquired strength to stand up and brace against opposition and carry through difficult and perplexing enterprises. You do not love contention, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm gathering from this is that this woman isn't naturally argumentative or bossy or just, hard to deal with just because that's her nature. She has acquired strength to stand up and brace against opposition and carry through difficult and perplexing enterprises. So in other words, this is how she's trained herself to be, and not that it's necessarily a good thing. Some might read this and say, hey, acquiring strength to stand up, well, that's a good thing. But what Ellen White is saying here is, hey, you've developed a habit to brace yourself against opposition, right? And correct me if I'm wrong here, but the way this is coming across to me is that if she has her experience controverted or crossed or, countered, she's going to brace herself against that and resist correction.
I actually think Ellen White means it more generally than that. That's included.
Yeah.
I think that she's just trying to lay out some of the general characteristics about this woman which have influenced her, and some of it is positive, some of it is negative, some of it can be negative or positive depending on the circumstance. And I think this is one that can be negative or positive in that it depends what the opposition is. Is it opposition just to her own preferences? In that circumstance, that attribute that she had developed would be negative. But in other circumstances, it might be positive. Like she's not going to just be taken down by some sort of opposition to her. So it's kind of, acquiring strength, that can be positive, for sure. Even the first sentence, firmness is a strong and controlling influence in your mind. Well, strong, controlling, okay. I mean, firmness can be good, firmness can be bad. It just depends totally on the context. You do not love contention, that's obviously positive. But then you are highly sensitive and feel deeply. Feel deeply can be positive, can also be negative. Highly sensitive, maybe more likely negative in this context. But
you let emotion rule more more than reason. If you're highly sensitive,
Exactly.
that can just lead to sentimentalism in some regards, or just giving into emotion rather than reason.
True. It can also lend to empathy, though, as well. And so, like, there could be a positive manifestation of that, but evidently, like, Ellen White, she's trying to point out, like, hey, these are some characteristics, and I think she is trying to kind of say these can be used for good or for evil, but...
Well, she does say, had your physical health been unimpaired, you would have made an eminently useful woman.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
But she's, also pointing out how this woman has allowed these attributes to be misused.
Kind of overruling in her life.
Yeah, ruling over reason and also experiment.
Okay. Good. Yeah, I wanted to go over that a bit, better understand that.
Excellent. Did you have anything else?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other comments or questions before we continue in the paragraph? Okay, we'll continue here. So the last thing that we read was Ellen White pointing out to her that her experience was not a correct experience. And again, what she's referring to is that she decided to go with a certain way of eating because she experienced the least disturbance from that. And Ellen White was saying that her experience was not correct. Your stomach was not receiving that vigor that it should from your food. Taken in a liquid state, your food would not give healthful vigor or tone to the system. But when you change this habit and eat more solids and less liquids, your stomach will feel disturbed. Notwithstanding this, you should not yield the point. You should educate your stomach to bear a more solid diet. You have worn too great an amount of clothing and have debilitated the skin by so doing. You have not given your body a chance to breathe. The pores of the skin, or little mouths through which the body breathes, have become closed, and the system has been filled with impurities. I just want to point out again what Teresa did, that we shouldn't allow ourselves to go, oh, well, this is our health advice. No, this is not our health advice. This is health advice that Ellen White is passing along to this woman, evidently from physicians. And she's passing this along, and that's the best advice given from the physicians in her day. It's not necessarily the best advice in our day. We'd have to look up, what conditions require more liquid diet, what conditions require more solid, according to the best health authorities of our day. So let's just keep that in mind. And, really our focus here is principles Ellen White is conveying. Continuing on. Your habit of riding out in the open air and sunshine has been very beneficial. Your life out of doors has sustained you so that you have the measure of physical strength that you now enjoy. But you have neglected other exercise, which was even more essential than this. You have depended upon your carriage to go even a short distance. You have thought that if you walked even a little way, it would injure you, and you have felt weary in doing so. But in this, your experience is not reliable. I think that's just so great how, the person's like, oh, well, I start to do this and then I feel fatigued or whatever. And Ellen White's like, no, your experience is not reliable. And I think we can all relate to that in feeling really tired or not wanting to get up to do something. And we just, feel lazy or whatever. But that experience is not something we should depend on. And I'm sure we've all experienced what it's like to then actually just get up and do it because we know we should, and then suddenly we get all this energy. That can happen. Or sometimes we don't, but then we power through it, and then it benefits us.
And this, of course, is the majority of the cases, but if you know that you have an unusual circumstance and it's just not normal, the amount of fatigue that you have, the message doesn't teach, just ignore that and push through it. You need to try to find answers to those types of situations too.
Absolutely. There has to be a scientific investigation. And I want to point out, though, okay, so you said if you know that it's like an unusual amount of fatigue or whatever, I just want to point out that you can't actually know until the tests have been done. Because at that point, it's just your experience. And you may feel like it's like totally unusual and whatever, and then go and have tests done and whatever, and it turns out that you should actually just power through it.
That's a good point.
Or it might be the reverse. It might be, oh, no, this is something else, and it needs to be dealt with in this other way. But the point is, you have to check it out. Like, you have to go find out, have proper diagnosis and whatever. But anyway, yeah, the principle, though, is quite plain, that we are not to just go by our own experience and think that if something is unpleasant or causes us disturbance, that it's therefore bad for us, or that we shouldn't do it, depending on circumstances. So anyway, there's definitely a lot here. I'm looking at the time, and we should probably wrap up soon. And I've been kind of debating whether to go through this next paragraph or not. In part, I want to go through it because it really continues on from what we just read, but also I don't want to rush through it, and it's a long paragraph. And if there's anything that kind of stands out there that we want to discuss, I don't really want to have to cut it short and all of that. So,
it's a hard one to know, because as I look at it, I'm thinking, man, they're really, like, I don't see, but that's just me, I don't see where there could be all that much need for more discussion on those points, because it's getting into, like, specifics of the husband and wife interaction. But, yeah, I'm torn, because I'd kind of like to finish this next paragraph, too, because it ties together. It's a good breaking point. But, I don't know.
Does anyone else have any thoughts?
I have a question.
Okay.
Okay, where do you draw the line? I'm gonna give you an example that sounds ridiculous, but for example, my experience when eating certain foods. Certain foods I feel good eating, certain foods that I just really don't feel very good eating. I have no reason to. One of them is coffee. I really like coffee. I haven't drank it for years, and just recently I would start drinking it again, and I get sick when I drink it. I feel like, weirdly, my eye gets all bloodshot, and I just don't feel good. I feel like it's making me sick. And so, you know what? I just stopped drinking it, and I feel much better. Now, that's my experience. I would say that my own experiments are pretty much, when I drink coffee, my eye starts really hurting, and I know that sounds really bizarre. And when I don't drink coffee, it just is never a problem. So, okay, obviously I could go to the doctor, and I don't know, I don't even know how I would test that. Is that, what would you do in a case like that? I know that sounds ridiculous, but.
No, that's a great example. So, here's the thing. It kind of like what we've talked about before, how even with studying various ancient scriptures and whatever, or topics in general, there's an order of priority. There are things that are more important to do and things that are less important to do, or things that are more urgent, and so on. And so, for this, it's not like coffee is a necessity or you're going to be suffering without it. So it's not really any sort of urgent thing for you to get to the bottom of it. So why suffer in the meantime? Even if, let's just say, who knows what it really is or not, but let's just say it was just totally some sort of psychological thing or whatever. I'm not saying that that's what it is at all, but let's just say that that's what it was, and it could easily be fixed just by whatever, it still might just not be worth it. And still, no matter what it is, even if it's a false experience, it's still what you're going through at the time. So why go through it for no reason? So in my mind, in that circumstance, it doesn't really, it doesn't appear to be a problem to just not do it. It seems like it makes sense. If you're experiencing bad symptoms and you think it might be connected to, some particular thing, and you're fine without that thing, then sure, avoid it. I think that seems totally fair.
Okay, I want to make sure that I'm understanding the principles as well. And this also might be helpful for you, Mary, if I am understanding the principles well. One thing that we wouldn't want to do, even though it's fine to just say, well, I don't need this particular food in order, for some necessary nutrients, so I feel better without it, apparently, and I'm just not going to have it. But if we were to say, oh, well, I know or I claim or whatever that this particular food or drink or whatever is causing XYZ in me. Well, can we really know that unless we do have tests ran and, that sort of thing? So would it be that while it's fine, it doesn't violate any principles to just leave it off without having experimentation done? It would be wrong to make a claim about it without experimentation done.
Yes, without experimentation done, for sure. I will say, though, that when we're talking about experiment, it depends on how rigorous we want to get, because different experiments can reveal different things and give you different degrees of certainty as to the overall picture or the answer, the ultimate answer to the question you're trying to find out. So one form of minor experiment that could be done is to see, okay, let's say drink coffee and, get sick. Okay, so that's just a correlation. Okay, so you might do that again. That's a minor experiment. Does it happen again? Oh, it happened again. Okay, so that's correlation again, but it, may indicate that it's not just a total chance correlation. Maybe the correlation is a meaningful correlation. Mm-hmm. So, you have to weigh how many times do I want to try this before I really establish that there's a strong correlation. And the other thing is, how controlled are those experiments? Are you canceling out other things? Are you doing everything else the same and then doing this? Or doing it in different circumstances? Is it actually just drinking this, or is it drinking it at this time or with whatever, or who knows? Eliminating the variables and isolating this one thing that you're trying to test. But again, it just might not be worth the time and the effort to do all that, and it might be best to just leave it off altogether. But basically, all I'm trying to say with this in response to your comment is that, yes, it's wrong to make claims without experiment, and basically the claims that are made should go as far as the experiments show. And you could have experiments that are even minor experiments that seem to indicate, like, okay, it seems like there is a real, like a meaningful correlation here. And when it comes to this issue, probably at that point it's enough to say, okay, we're done with this. There's a meaningful correlation, and this seems to be causing that.
Okay, so you can take it as far as, let's just say, coffee seems to be causing not to feel well in the eye. And that would be fair to say after experimentation, correlation showing. But to go and say it's this or that in the coffee that is causing this or that in me would be going too far, I would think.
Well, yeah, at that point,
yeah.
It would be, unless there was other information input that informed that.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say one other thing. People might be listening to this, whether now or later, and thinking, okay, I thought we weren't supposed to drink coffee anyway. Like, what's that about, And we're just to go with the best health authorities of our day. That's the council. And if you look at what the best health authorities have to say about various foods and their effects on the body, that should govern our actions today. And so if you don't know what's being said about a certain food, then you should go to the health authorities to find out, and then that should govern our actions on whether we partake in certain foods or not.
Right. So we can't just say Ellen White spoke against coffee, so therefore coffee is wrong. No, we have to go with the best information today. So anyway, does that help at all, Mary?
Yes, that was very, very good. Thank you very much. And because it's coffee, I have tried the experiment many, many times, and bizarrely, my eye gets all bloodshot. But I've tried it probably one too many times. But I've just come to the conclusion that, yeah, it's making me sick. And so thank you. That's great principles. I appreciate it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's weird. We are all chemical interactions, and anything we put into our bodies is causing chemical interactions. And for whatever reason, I mean, biology is so complex, and we all have our own quirks and everything. I guess your thing is coffee. I can't have onion or garlic or anything else in that family. And that's just the way it goes. So anyway, yeah, that was a really good question, though, and I think that brought out some really good practical principles.
And it solves the dilemma of whether or not to try to move on to the next paragraph.
Totally. Okay, cool. Well, all that said, we can continue on our discussion and our reading tomorrow. So would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, we just want to praise you and thank you for constantly teaching us truth, and help us to really absorb and be acutely aware of this truth about genuine experience, and not to take it lightly and apply it to our lives in everything we do. So we thank you, and we pray for a blessing. Thank you for the Sabbath day. In the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Lila Tove, have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.